the vast majority of people out there have the wrong perception of what CRO or experimentation is. You take big things and you break them down into the assumptions that you have about them, into manageable separate things that you can test. It's a process of critical thinking.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Click to Buy. Today I have my guest Jonny on, and our episode today is going to be a lot about CRO experimentation and kind of making an experimentation mindset, among other things. Well, Jonny, welcome to Click to Buy. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me.
Well, we're so excited to hear everything that you have to say. But first, for the audience that doesn't know who you are yet, maybe you can explain a little bit about what it is that you do.
Absolutely. So at the moment, I am the digital experience director of a performance marketing agency called Journey Further. So the agency as a whole is coming up to about 200 people, and we do paid media, organic, and digital experience, which is the part that I run. And that's all underpinned by a very sort of strong strategy and creative function. Um, the digital experience division, majority of what we do is retained experimentation program management for clients. So we run
Mhm.
CRO, digital experimentation programs for a range of clients, a lot in e-commerce retail, but we've got clients in various other sectors like hospitality and lead generation.
Nice.
Um, yeah, and just a bit on my background. So I've been in digital experimentation since it was invented. So been doing it for just over 15 years now, I think. Along the way, I've run other agency teams. I've been a management consultant. I've also been in-house. So most notably, I built and ran one of the UK's sort of largest and most progressive in-house experimentation functions at Sky. Um, so yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the little intro. I think it'll be especially interesting to hear your takes because now you work with a lot of different brands, but previously also having worked in-house, you kind of have the experience on both sides of the coin, which I think is really helpful for, I know a lot of brands out there who are starting with CRO, they're making the decision, do we work with like an agency or do we hire in-house? So really interested for your hot take on that later.
Yeah.
But to start off, I always like to start with a little hot topic. So, this or that on different common like D2C CRO tactics. So, of course, we know in CRO, not everything will work for every brand. But if you only could pick one of these tactics and you were working with an let's say one of your customers and giving them some advice on getting to know their customer, if you could only pick one, would you pick customer surveys versus customer interviews? Which would you pick and why?
Um, Probably customer surveys, and only because for me,
Hmm.
I think like with customer data, the sweet spot is the balance between quant and qual. So things like customer interviews and user testing is incredibly valuable for qualitative reasons, but you can't really recruit a lot of people. Um, Data analysis is the opposite. It's quantitative, but you get no qualitative insight from it. So surveys have quite a good balance of being able to capture relatively qualitative data, but from a significant number of people. So for that reason, I would say surveys. However, it completely depends on the objective.
True. I like how you kind of explained that as well because you, with the survey, you can kind of get that little mix of quantitative, obviously the hard numbers, but maybe also some qualitative if you have some open questions. Nice. And let's do another one just to get us warmed up. So, if you could only pick one, would you prefer on like a homepage a carousel on the top versus a well-designed static image?
Um, Obviously, what I'm going to say is you should test that. um,
Yeah.
but if somebody pointed a gun at me and said we could do one of these, I would probably say the
Mhm.
static image, only because I have experienced quite a lot of those tests, and more often than not, the static image wins over the carousel. However, not always. So
Yeah. It's a good point. We actually, our last guest, Ruben, had a whole explanation as well about how, like, he would, different elements you should have on your page. For example, a lot of time you hear social proof, but he also recently ran an experiment where social proof actually detracted rather than helped as well because it was a distraction. So, as you said, testing is always important to validate any decision that you're
Yeah,
going to be making for your page.
yeah. There's absolutely no such thing as a best practice. So you just never know
Mm-hmm.
how things are
And
going to
kind of
turn
on
out.
that note, maybe if you had to give advice to other brands, how could you encourage them to create an experimentation culture?
Yeah. So, I mean, I answer this questions for
Mm-hmm.
brands a lot because I do quite a lot of consulting for businesses who want to build an experimentation culture. There's no sort of easy, quick answer to it, unfortunately. Like I have a model that I work through clients with, which I call the building blocks of
Mm-hmm.
experimentation, which is number one, you need a really good articulation of what you are trying to achieve that can be translated into a process of innovation via experimentation. The analogy I often use is if when we wanted to get man on the moon, that involved a lot of experiments around rocket propulsion, but there was that goal of getting somebody to the moon. So experimentation really only works in the context of an idea of where you're trying to go and what your strategy is. So that sort of innovation strategy is number one. Then what I would call an operating system. So, the second you start having ideas that come, for experiments that come out of that strategy, you are going to need to sort of organize things, prioritize things, manage the workflow, and that sort of stuff. And if you don't get that right from the start, you're not going to get very far. So that's effectively both a project management system of some
Mm-hmm.
description, but also your agreed ways of working and processes and how you do things, how you measure things and stuff like
Mm,
that.
first, I was going to say, I absolutely love your
Cool.
analogy about going to the moon. I think, like, kind of taking that a step further, we saw there were so many things that, like, were developed kind of by accident just by kind of striving for that sort of innovation. So I already think that's a great tip when you're thinking about kind of creating that mindset. Sorry, maybe I cut you off. Did you have a third kind of point to add there?
No, no, yeah. Well, just
Uh-huh.
carrying on from
Yeah.
what you were saying, it's something I talk about quite a lot because the vast majority of people out there have the wrong perception of what CRO or experimentation is, through no fault of their own. There are, the way that it's been sold over the years has sort of created some quite strange practices around it and some quite strange perceptions. So most people, when they think of it, without realizing it, they will have quite a strange, twisted understanding of what it is. And what I always try and say to people is just forget everything that you ever thought about
Mm-hmm.
CRO for a minute and just think of it as like this, which is nothing great that's ever happened in the history of modern civilization has happened without the scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
All modern technological innovations, medical, and other sort of scientific innovations have come about as a result of the scientific method, and that is critical aptitude, critical scientific modes of thinking, and an iterative process. And that's basically what it is. If you do it right, you're just trying to put that sort of culture and mindset into a business. For some
Mm-hmm.
reason, businesses have never thought like that. Like nobody ever thought, let's borrow this process from the guys who've done the most amazing things that have ever
Mm-hmm.
happened and try and like make our business follow the same path. Nobody ever does that for some reason. They just go, oh, we'll just guess and we'll just use our opinion because we know. Um, so that's really what experimentation is. So, like, I often use analogies from the world of science because that basically is what we're trying to do. We're trying to replicate that way of thinking in the business
I
world.
love that. And maybe taking it just like a step further. So let's say someone is starting CRO now, they're starting to adopt this mindset. How can you make this CRO experimentation even more strategic? Like, how do you take it to that next level once you've already maybe started this base?
Yeah, that's a great question and something that I talk about a lot at the
Mm-hmm.
moment. if you look at CRO and how CRO is done in virtually any company that it's done, it's generally a kind of exercise in tinkering with things. And
Mm-hmm.
so you'll find that there is a huge long list of things that you could do to a website, like moving things around and stuff like that. And the objective is to just basically churn through that list and try and find the things that are most successful or make the most money. Um, but it misses a trick really, because actually experimentation is a really good way of helping you answer strategic questions that you have about the business.
Mm.
Um, and But people don't really think of using it like that. So, you imagine businesses will have these sort of big things that they're grappling with, like, should we launch into new markets? Should we completely redesign the whole checkout? Should we fundamentally change our pricing and promotional strategy? Or should we change the proposition of the whole business or the product or something like
Mm-hmm.
that? And um, the traditional way of answering these questions is either just to sort of take a punt and guess and do it, or maybe to give somebody like McKinsey £500,000 and get them to come and give you an answer.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't need to. You can test these things. Like, it doesn't matter how big they are. You can test them if you approach it in the right way. And unfortunately, again, the history of CRO has sort of driven it towards this thing where it's seen as about tinkering around with basic elements of UX. But you can test anything. If you just approach it in the right way, you take big things and you break them down into the assumptions that you have about them, into manageable separate things that you can test. It's a process of critical thinking. It's exactly how science works. So, yeah, I personally very strongly believe that experimentation um, has a role to play in an area that it's not and has never really been used before, which is in that sort of area of more broad business innovation.
Yeah, I'm kind of jumping along that line of thought. So, what you've mentioned there, which kind of stood out to me, is that other areas of the business can also benefit from CRO. Do you have maybe other examples of other places within a business that should adopt this mindset, in your opinion?
Yeah, I'll give you a concrete example.
Uh-huh.
So we have a client that is a quite a large physical retail store, but they also have a very strong online presence. And whenever we talk to them about strategic things, their number one problem that they struggle with is how to appeal to a younger audience. So their brand is perceived as an older brand,
Mm.
where the product actually, there's no reason why that product should be for an older person. It's just a legacy thing. It's just a brand thing that they've become known to be this sort of brand for an older audience. So their number one question is, how do we appeal to a younger audience? How do we shift the brand and the audience to being a younger audience? Um, and again, most people would think, that's not something you can test,
Mm-hmm.
but it 100% is. So, like, as I was talking about, first of all, you have to break down the assumptions within that. Now, if you're going to appeal to a younger audience, the only way that would happen is three possible ways, and it could be one or more or all of them. But one is that you need to change the product itself, that your product is just simply attractive to that older audience.
Mm-hmm.
Two is that it's all about how you target people through marketing, that you are, your actual targeting and the modes of communication that you're using is targeting older people, and that needs to shift. And three, it could be about your brand tone of voice and the way you communicate and all that sort of stuff that needs to change. So there's three possible things that are contributing to the issue. And each one of those you can take as a hypothesis in and of itself and test it. So if you take something like the product, um, let's for example, you have landing pages, category landing pages within the website.
Mm-hmm.
You can very easily test fundamentally changing the nature of the products that are merchandised on those product pages to see what happens to conversion rates. And you can measure your experimentation against demographic audiences by using the demographic information that comes out of Google Analytics and things like that, or there are other methods of doing that. So there's a test which is, ostensibly just a kind of a similar kind of CRO test. However, it is helping you answer that question as to whether products are the issue or not.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, if you look at the targeting hypothesis, that becomes very easy to test within media itself. So you can test that sort of stuff within PPC, within social advertising, and that sort of stuff. And to come back and answer your original question, you can
Mm-hmm.
see here how your experimentation is now sitting across different parts of the business, not necessarily just in the UX of the website. And it's helping you to answer a bigger strategic question that you have about the business as a whole. And that same principle can apply to anything. Like, there's no reason why you can't apply the principle of critical thinking and experimentation to things like supply chain or,
Mm-hmm.
customer service or anything like that.
I think that's a really, really profound kind of answer. Thank you for explaining everything, especially because I think what you said makes a lot of sense. Like, if the product is the problem, then that's why you're maybe not selling as much as you want, not because you haven't ran a certain experiment on X part of your UX. So, by incorporating this mindset, it sounds like you're saying across the business, all these strategic choices should probably have a little bit of a bigger impact on your overall strategy as a business itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's about
Mm-hmm.
understanding that the process of critical thinking and testing and investigation can be applied to the business as a whole, as opposed to just sort of tinkering around with small things. One of the issues, I think, is that people equate experimentation with A/B testing, i.e., with software. So,
Mm-hmm.
they if you ask somebody what they think CRO is or they think experimentation is, they would instantly think of a piece of software that does A/B testing, and that makes them think of, you know, messing around with elements of UX. They don't think of it as actually a process and a way of doing business. And
Mm-hmm.
if you went into any sort of credible scientific institution or university and asked a scientist what they do, they would not say, "I do experimentation." They would tell you what they're trying to achieve, and they would tell you that they are a scientist, and they would tell you, what it is that drives them. They wouldn't say, "I do experimentation." But the problem is,
Mm-hmm.
in the business world, even we're having this conversation now about experimentation, and I tend to
Yes.
say experimentation instead of CRO and things like that. But all of that is basically focusing everything on just a tool, effectively. Experimentation is a tool of the scientific method. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
I think the most important thing that businesses can do is to try not to think of the technical aspect of experimentation, and try to think of how can we use evidence-based thinking and evidence-based processes to help us answer these questions that we have and achieve what we want and innovate the business. And experimentation might be one of the things that you would do, but there will be other things as well, like data analysis and other forms of validation and things like that.
I think that's a really, really good point. So I work for Instant, and we're a tool for Shopify, stores on Shopify. And so when I'm writing a lot of blogs, I have this kind of same mindset. People want to know how to do XYZ to their landing page, but what they really want to know is, how do I sell better on Shopify? How do I sell better? So it's thinking about the big picture and realizing there's lots of different kind of tools in the toolkit, let's say, using kind of your analogy, and strategies and tactics they can use to approach that. So like you said, experimentation is one of them, but it's only kind of one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and that principle, the principle that I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
applies across all areas of business, really. And it's a very
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate thing that a lot of people tend to view software and tools as the answer
Mm-hmm.
to problems, when they are only, I mean, sometimes they are a very important part of the answer to a problem,
Sure.
but they're never the whole answer. So,
Yeah.
if somebody's problem is, how do I sell better on Shopify?
Mm-hmm.
There's no way you can answer that question without understanding things about the nature of your product, the nature of the proposition, how it's resonating with
Exactly.
customers and things like that. And a tool might help you execute whatever the answer is to your problem, but there is no way that a tool is just going to magically help you answer that problem. So, and it's exactly the same in the field of experimentation. You have to have a really clear goal strategy. You have to understand what it is you're trying to achieve, such that
Hmm.
experimentation can help you do that. But it will never in and of itself be a panacea.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and maybe kind of leaping off this discussion. So I think also when you're maybe trying to, let's say you're someone who is now more interested in experimentation, they've heard this podcast. I think a big part of that is convincing maybe people at an upper level that there's going to be a good ROI on doing these sorts of experiments. So I'm really curious, in your experience, how can you gauge the ROI of experimentation?
Yeah, it's a a very sort of contentious area, I guess, because
Yeah.
it's very easy in theory to measure the ROI of experimentation.
Hmm.
So an A/B test is 50% of people saw this, 50% of people saw this, and you can
Hmm.
measure that the thing that you're testing has a 5% uplift in conversion rate. So it becomes
Hmm.
very easy to say, well, if that was true across a year, that would mean this amount of money for us. And everybody who does CRO does that. But once you start scratching the surface, that's quite problematic thing to do in a few different areas. So number one, you've observed something in a period of time that you've tested, and that's not necessarily going to pan out over time. It's a
Hmm.
huge assumption to say that that would play out over the 12-month period. Um, it does. What you've done is found a way of making a really good decision. Should you do this thing? Yes, you should, but you can't
Hmm.
prove how much money it's going to make over time. But the other thing is that it sort of misleads people as to what experimentation is.
Hmm.
Everything that we just talked about the strategic aspects of experimentation gets kind of forgotten because it is seen as this sort of tactical revenue driving thing. And it is, that's one of the important things that it does, but ultimately what it really is two things: risk management and innovation, R&D. And those are the most important ways that you can look at experimentation. And risk management, um, not only are you finding things that work, you are
Hmm.
not doing things that don't work. And in a way, that is can be more lucrative than trying to kind of find these winning tests with positive ROI revenue value. And one of the ways that I always try and explain to senior people the purpose of
Hmm.
experimentation and get them sort of fired up about it is by flipping the coin and showing them the risk inherent with the decisions that they're making. You can go to a sort of a CEO and say, look, I did this test, it's going to make £100,000. And they may or may not believe you. If they don't believe you, they're not really losing anything. But if you go and say, see this thing that you have done, that you've
Hmm.
invested in, it doesn't work. And that is risk. That's the risk inherent with decision making. And that is ultimately what experimentation is. It's you are making better decisions about the things that you're investing in, and therefore having less risk in the business. And unfortunately, there is no neat way of calculating ROI of that. If risk management
Hmm.
in terms of financial risk management is famously problematic because it is very hard to measure the
Yeah.
ROI of, because if risk management is successful, nothing happens. Nothing bad
Yeah.
happens. So you don't know what would have happened had you not done it.
That's
So
true.
it's a similar kind of problematic area. So um, but we're getting to this sort of situation where we
Hmm.
appreciate that you're asking people to do something, you're asking people to invest in doing something, and they need to
Hmm.
see that. So the easiest way you can do that is to kind of calculate the ROI in the traditional way that I sense. But
Hmm.
very quickly, it's important to get people to understand the real mechanics of how it makes money. I have several videos that I've put out on Loom and things like that about exactly that sort of problem.
Yeah, well, definitely. If you want to send me those, I'll add them to the show notes in case anyone's interested in kind of diving deeper on that topic. I think it's quite interesting what you said about how positioning it as a risk management or risk assessment type of um, explanation as well. So you don't fall into the trap of just the traditional, as you said, CRO mindset that a lot of people think about before kind of considering all these elements we've spoken about today.
A really simple way to understand
Uh-huh.
it. A couple of years ago, Harvard Business School teamed up with the A/B testing platform Optimizely, and they analyzed all of the historical data out of Optimizely. So thousands and thousands of tests that had been run by thousands of websites around the world. And they were looking at all this sort of nuanced statistical stuff, but the overarching stat that came out of it was that only 1 in 10 of those tests was able to prove whatever it was set out to prove. So that's thousands and
Wow.
thousands of things that people thought were a good idea,
Yeah.
changes that they were making to their website, content changes, functionality changes, and only 1 in 10 of them was actually able to demonstrate any benefit to the business. So the other way to look at that is that if you are not experimenting, 90% of your investment in content, web development, or effort of your people is a waste of time and money potentially. And that is why you do experimentation. You are avoiding a huge amount of wastage in your effort. So, and that is quite intangible to try and demonstrate the ROI of, but it's nevertheless
Yeah.
very, very real. And the second anyone starts running experiments, they will see this, because what they see is that the things that seem like they would work do not work. So
Mm.
you once you get to that point, you don't need to demonstrate ROI to anybody, because they'll see,
Yeah.
oh, we need to do this because our ideas are rubbish.
Well, that's a great example. If I wasn't already pro experimentation, you would have had me convinced. I would love, maybe based on the last thing you said, you had some things which you would expect to work wouldn't work, or kind of vice versa. Maybe as we get near the end of this podcast, it would be fun to hear. Do you have any memorable experiments that you've run? Maybe something that worked differently than you would have hypothesized?
Oh, hundreds and hundreds, yeah, yeah, lots. If anybody listening to this wants to follow me on LinkedIn, I do
Mm-hmm.
pretty much every week a particular type of post that I call unexpected experiments results, which is exactly this. But I mean, some of the sort of more interesting ones.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a client that sells towels and bedding, and
Mm-hmm.
we tested this a few years ago now, but we tested just simply putting a very small statement on the product page above where the call to action was, to remind people that they could return products for free. So it just said free returns, free simple returns, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the thinking is that, when you're buying towels, particularly, people like to feel the towels. And so they probably worry about buying things online. And so we just, we put that in, but we decided to test it. And that reduced the conversion rate by an enormous amount. If I can remember rightly, it was about 15% or something like that. Now, why, is anybody's guess. Which is completely a guess. My guess would be that the particular audience that it's aimed at, for whatever reason, would be concerned about why they should return it. So they might think, why would I want to return it? Is it not very good? Or
Oh.
do lots of people return it? If you're telling me that I get free returns, is that because people returning it is a common thing? And then potentially that
Yeah.
reduces the confidence. But like I say, I have hundreds of examples like that, where
Mm-hmm.
what you initially think, and particularly things that are sort of common best practices, that I could probably find hundreds of articles online that would tell you to do exactly that thing as a best
Yeah.
practice, that you should always make it clear that you get free returns. But in that case, it had a very detrimental impact. And that is just one of hundreds of examples that I could give you like that. So you never
Well,
ever know. You just never know how people are going to respond to things. So
yeah.
test it, test it, test everything.
That's a great example also with like towels. Indeed, you would think like when you buy that in person, I'm also with anything like bed sheets or stuff, I want to feel it. I want to know that it's like comfortable, but really a surprising result. So thanks for sharing that story. So I just have two more questions for you before we round up the episode.
Yeah.
Um, and also a chance for you to ask a question for our next guest. So I always ask all of our guests, what is something that you think most businesses get wrong when it comes to their customer journey? If you could pick just one thing.
I'm going to say not um, not having a cohesive strategy that is translated down into the executional layers of the business. So, and what I
Mm-hmm.
mean by that is, we go into any business and just find out what they're doing in PPC or anything, and they will
Mm-hmm.
be running those sort of channels and activities in a generic way, and measuring them in a generic way. But nobody is sort of adapting anything to a very specific business strategy. So and that kind of bleeds into everything. So I would say that there
Mm-hmm.
mostly is a business strategy somewhere. It's just that it's not
Yeah.
communicated and it's not translated into the way that things are actually done.
Great, good answer. I definitely think that's quite an important piece of advice for businesses out there that are thinking about their customer journey and experimentation. Kind of switching to a different note, I have a question for you from our previous guest, Ruben. So Ruben runs kind of some educational initiatives to help people who are just getting started with CRO. But he said a big issue that he finds is when people are graduating his program, they have a hard time finding a job when they're getting started with CRO because either the level of experience needed is like 2 or 3 years and they don't have that yet, or for a smaller business that might look for someone for CRO, they just can't like afford to add someone in house. So, do you have any advice for people who are just getting started with CRO on how they can kind of get some of their first opportunities?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing.
Mm-hmm.
As an agency, we have actually adapted a lot of our processes so that we can take juniors with no prior experience.
Mm-hmm.
If for anyone out there who runs an agency or any kind of anyone sort of doing CRO, I
Mm-hmm.
would urge them to do the same thing. But it does mean having sort of really well-tuned processes and things like that that people can follow. But it is an unfortunate thing that most people hiring for CRO are looking for experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bit of a dead end thing because if there's never any new experience coming in, what do you do? But I would say for people actually looking for a role,
Mm-hmm.
um, the most obvious thing is to try and find a role that is not a dedicated CRO role. So there will be roles that are sort of more broader digital marketing roles, that will incorporate elements of CRO, and they will be more readily available as junior and entry level roles.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really the best thing I would do would be to try and look for an entry level digital marketing or sort of product style role that that feels like it has the potential to allow growth towards that area. The added advantage of that is that you actually might find that there are other things that you want to specialize in as well. Um,
True.
but yeah, it's a bit of a sad thing that that just is difficult. But that would be my advice.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I'll definitely pass that along to Ruben and his students. I think that's also kind of a good point based on everything you and I discussed today is that those skill sets can be useful in so many different areas of a business. So maybe that will help kind of open the door to a business that then you can kind of push yourself into a role that is more maybe your end goal if you want to be full CRO. But indeed, for digital marketing or marketing roles, definitely that experimentation mindset is going to bring you really far. So definitely good advice. And now for my last question, we'll have another guest on, I think, next week who is also in the CRO experimentation kind of role mindset. So I would love to know if you have a question that I could pass along to our next guest. It can be anything CRO related, experimentation related.
Yeah,
Whatever comes to mind.
yeah. Sort of a slightly fun question, I guess.
Mhm.
I have always hated the term version optimization and CRO, because I think it really sort of limits people's understanding of what experimentation can do. So, what might else? I mean, we're stuck with that term now. It won't go away. But if it did, what what else would you call CRO? What would be the term that you would use to try and encapsulate everything that it has as a potential?
I love that. Let's rebrand CRO, see if
Yeah,
there's something better out there. Well, thank you so much for a great episode today, Johnny. So, as we said in the beginning of the show, you can find him on LinkedIn. Do you have a website people could find you on if they're
I
interested, or
do.
somewhere
Yeah,
else?
it's just jonnylongden.com.
All right, so you heard it here. We'll make sure you put all the resources we discussed today in the show notes. Johnny, thank you so much for being such a great guest. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And that's another episode of Click to Buy. We'll see you in the next episode.